My parents were furious that I bought my first house without asking their advice. Days later, I found out they had already promised my sister, her husband, and their 3 kids they could move in with me. I calmly said, no. At Grandma's 85th birthday, the truth finally came out. Hello everyone, my name is Claire Bennett. I'm 35 years old, and the happiest day of my life lasted exactly 43 minutes. That was how long I got to enjoy owning my very first home. Then my mother called. You bought a house? She didn't sound excited. She sounded angry. I did. Why didn't you ask us first? I laughed softly. I'm 35, Mom. I didn't know I needed permission. There was a long silence. Then she quietly said, You've made a terrible mistake. I thought she meant the mortgage, the neighborhood, the interest rate. I was wrong. 3 days later, I accidentally discovered my parents had already promised my new house to my older sister. Not a room, not a temporary stay, the entire upstairs, for my sister, her husband, and their 3 children, without ever asking me. 5 days after that, at Grandma's 85th birthday dinner, one simple question changed everything. Looking back, I should have seen it coming. Growing up, my older sister, Melissa, was always the family favorite. Not because she was cruel. She wasn't. She was simply the child everyone worried about. She married young, had 3 children before turning 30. Her husband, Jake, worked hard, but money always seemed tight. Whenever something went wrong, Mom and Dad stepped in. Rent, groceries, school supplies, car repairs. If Melissa needed help, the family helped. I never complained, because I loved my nieces and nephew. I wanted them to have stability. But there was always one difference. Whenever I succeeded, people assumed I didn't need anything. I graduated college with honors. Mom smiled proudly, then immediately reminded me, Your sister could really use your old laptop. When I received my first promotion, Dad congratulated me, then asked, Could you loan Melissa a little money this month? Every milestone somehow became someone else's opportunity. Eventually, I stopped talking about my accomplishments. I quietly built my life instead. I became an interior designer. The work wasn't glamorous. Long hours, impossible deadlines, clients who changed their minds every week. But I loved it. For nearly 10 years, I saved every extra dollar, skipped vacations, drove the same aging sedan, packed lunches instead of eating out, because I had one dream, owning my own house. Not a mansion, just somewhere peaceful, a place where every wall, every window, every room belonged to me. Then, one rainy Thursday afternoon, I signed the closing papers. When the realtor handed me the keys, I cried. The house wasn't enormous. 3 bedrooms, a small backyard, a front porch with a wooden swing. Perfect. I spent the entire afternoon walking from room to room, imagining paint colors, bookshelves, a vegetable garden. For the first time, my future felt real. That evening, I posted one picture online, just me, standing on the porch, holding my keys. Within minutes, Mom called. You bought a house? I did. Why didn't you ask us first? I wanted it to be a surprise. You should have talked to us. Why? She hesitated, then simply replied, You've made a terrible mistake. Before I could ask what she meant, she ended the call. The next morning, Dad arrived unexpectedly. He walked through every room, nodded thoughtfully. Finally, he smiled. Melissa's family will fit nicely upstairs. I laughed. What? The kids can use the 2 smaller bedrooms. I stared at him. Dad, what are you talking about? He looked confused. Your mother didn't tell you? Tell me what? He smiled, as though discussing holiday plans. We already promised Melissa she could move in. I honestly thought he was joking. You promised? Who? Your sister. When? A few weeks ago. I felt the room spinning. You promised my house, even before I even closed on it. Dad shrugged. You're single. You don't need all this space. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This isn't a family house. It's mine. He looked disappointed. Family shares. I've shared my whole life. But I didn't spend 10 years saving, so someone else could move in. Dad sighed. I knew you'd be difficult. That sentence hurt more than anything else. Not because he disagreed, because he genuinely believed I was the selfish one. The following evening, Mom invited me over for dinner. Melissa and Jake were already there. 3 excited children ran around the living room. The oldest smiled at me. Aunt Claire, Mom says we're getting a huge backyard. I looked at Melissa. She smiled awkwardly. I thought you knew. I didn't. The room became quiet. Mom quickly interrupted. Well, now everyone does. Jake looked uncomfortable. I told Melissa we should ask first. Mom waved him off. It's family. I slowly looked around the room, then quietly answered, No, nobody moved. Melissa frowned. What? No? You aren't moving into my house. Mom slammed her hand onto the table. So you're choosing a building over your family. I shook my head. I'm choosing boundaries. Dad stood up. You've changed. I smiled sadly. No, I've finally stopped saying yes. Dinner ended early. Nobody hugged goodbye. Nobody even looked at me as I left. 5 days later, Grandma celebrated her 85th birthday. The entire family gathered at her favorite restaurant. Everyone acted strangely polite, as though waiting for something. Halfway through dinner, Mom finally cleared her throat. She smiled at Grandma. Claire has something she'd like to tell everyone. Every face turned toward me. Before I could speak, Grandma quietly raised one hand, then looked directly at my parents. I have a question first. The room fell silent. She folded her napkin, then calmly asked, why did the two of you promise someone else's house? When you don't own it, no one answered, not even my parents. Sometimes, the person who asks the quietest question is the one who changes everything. As my parents stared at Grandma across the birthday table and searched for an answer they didn't have, I realized the conversation they had tried to control was finally about to become the truth no one could avoid. The restaurant became completely silent. Grandma folded her hands on the table, then calmly repeated her question. Why did you promise someone else's house? When it doesn't belong to you? Mom forced a nervous smile. We were only trying to help Melissa. Grandma nodded. I understand, but that wasn't my question. Dad cleared his throat. We thought Claire would understand. Grandma looked at him. Did you ask her? No. Did she ever offer? No. Then why did you promise it? Neither of them answered, because there wasn't a good answer. Melissa quietly stared at her plate. Her husband Jake finally spoke. I told everyone we should wait until Claire was asked. The entire table turned toward him. Mom looked shocked. You never said that. Jake sighed. I said it 3 times. I told you it wasn't our decision. He looked at me. I'm sorry. I honestly believed you'd already agreed. I smiled gently. I know. Grandma slowly turned toward Melissa. Did you know the house had already been promised before Claire was told? Melissa hesitated, then quietly whispered, yes. The words hung heavily over the table. Grandma nodded sadly. So you packed your family for a house that wasn't yours. Tears filled Melissa's eyes. I thought. Mom and Dad had already talked to her. Grandma looked disappointed. You hoped? There's a difference. Nobody argued, because she was right. Mom suddenly became defensive. Claire has 3 bedrooms. Melissa has 3 children. It only made sense. I finally spoke. It made sense to you. It wasn't your mortgage. It wasn't your down payment. It wasn't the 10 years I spent saving. Dad rubbed his forehead. We weren't trying to hurt you. I answered softly. But you never once thought about me. Silence. I continued. When I was working late every weekend. Where was everyone? When I skipped vacations to save for a down payment. Who asked if I was okay? No one. I wasn't buying a house for the family. I was buying my first home. Grandma smiled gently. And every adult deserves a place that's truly their own. Jake reached for Melissa's hand. We'll find another solution. Melissa quietly nodded. I know. Then she looked directly at me. I'm sorry. I should have called you myself. I should have. I smiled. Thank you. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was honesty. After dinner, Grandma asked me to help her to her car. As we walked slowly across the parking lot, she smiled. You know what your grandfather always used to say? I laughed. What? If someone spends years building a dream, don't volunteer it to someone else. I smiled. He really said that. More than once, she squeezed my hand. I'm proud of you. For buying your home. And for finally protecting it. A week later, Dad called. His voice sounded quieter than I'd ever heard. Can I come over? I agreed. When he arrived, he stood on my front porch. He didn't walk inside. He waited. May I come in? That one question meant more than he realized. I smiled. Of course. He slowly walked through the house, then stopped in the living room. I never actually looked at this place. I know. I only imagined who else could live here. His voice broke. I never stopped to think about how hard you worked to make it happen. I looked around the room. The bookshelves I'd built, the plants on the windowsill, the framed photos from trips I'd finally been able to take. This house isn't just walls. It's every sacrifice I made. Dad nodded. I understand that now. A few days later, Melissa asked if we could have lunch. She arrived carrying a small box. Inside was the old ceramic house-shaped piggy bank we'd shared as children. She smiled through tears. You always put money into this. I always spent mine. We both laughed. I guess nothing really changed. She shook her head. It has. I've spent my whole life expecting someone else to rescue me. She looked down. I don't want my children growing up believing that's normal. Over the next year, Melissa and Jake saved enough to rent a larger house, not because someone handed it to them, because they worked together. The day they moved in, Melissa sent me a picture. Underneath it, she wrote, "This one feels better because we earned it." I smiled for a long time. Epilogue. 3 years have passed. I still live in the same house. The porch swing is finally painted white. The vegetable garden is overflowing every summer. Grandma still visits every Sunday. She always knocks first, even though she has a key. She says, "Respect doesn't disappear just because you're family." Dad now calls before stopping by. Every single time. Mom eventually apologized. Not once, many times. Not with expensive gifts, with changed behavior. She no longer volunteers my time, my money, or my home. Melissa and I became close again. Not because I gave her my house, because we finally learned to respect each other's lives. My thoughts. Looking back, buying my first house wasn't the hardest part. Learning to protect it was. Boundaries aren't walls built to keep family out. They're doors that allow relationships to survive with mutual respect. Helping someone should always be your choice, not a decision made on your behalf. Sometimes, the kindest word you'll ever say is no, because the people who truly love you will eventually learn to respect it.